Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Acton Lecture Series. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Acton Institute. And I'm very glad that you could join us. It's in this time of COVID. We can't have our normal lectures, but we're very happy to be able to live stream this. And I'm delighted to have as our speaker today, Dr. Elizabeth Corey. She's going to speak on the problems of intersectionality and the challenges. And intersectionality was a theory that's first popularized by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. But it's grown over the years and now plays a lot of a hot topic in debates in college campuses and beyond. So Dr. Elizabeth Corey is a professor of political science at Baylor. She's also the director of the honors program. She has her PhD from LSU. And she's going to speak here today about intersectionality and the challenges and the politics behind it, some of the history. So I hope after this lecture you'll stay and you can do Q&A. Please send in your questions to Acton's Facebook, Acton's Twitter. We'll get as many questions as we can to be answered. Our communications team is running this, so they're going to send those questions, kind of group them and send them to me. So I apologize beforehand if you don't get your question answered, but please do submit your questions to our Facebook and our Twitter, and I think there's some other locations as well, which I'll check on. But please do submit those, and so we look forward to the Q&A session after Dr. Corey's lecture on intersectionality.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Corey. I'm a professor of political science at Baylor in Waco, Texas, and it's a pleasure to be here with you virtually to talk about this very important topic of what is intersectionality. I'm going to begin by telling you how it started, how it originated, who invented the term, and then try to underscore the importance of it for the academic life, and then also essentially show the ways it's been used and abused by intersectionality theorists, and then make some criticisms of it. So I'll do all that in due course, over the course of about 30 minutes or so. I'm also going to show some some pictures that I think will help you to get a better sense of what intersectionality is all about, but you should know that I'm not a Zoom expert. So if there are any glitches, just bear with me. I'll try to get those pictures up for you to see so you'll have a sense of what's going on exactly. A good place to begin is by talking about the origins of the term. And the term intersectionality was actually coined in 1989, so it's only about 30 years old, by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, who wrote in a law journal, and she said this, that race and gender should not be understood as separate legal categories, but should be combined. They should engender a kind of new combined category. So in other words, while a woman might have discrimination claims on the basis of her sex, and a Black person could say he or she had been discriminated against on the basis of race, she was actually identifying a kind of oppression that affected Black women as Black women, not as Black, not as women alone. So neither sex nor race alone could capture the discrimination that they had endured. She makes this case, Crenshaw again, Kimberly Crenshaw makes the case by taking up several concrete legal cases, which I'm not going to talk about in depth, but the one that I wanted to emphasize is this one called DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. And in that case, 5 Black women sued General Motors for discrimination. GM had not hired Black women prior to 1964 and then had dismissed all its Black female employees after 1970. And so the plaintiffs in this case claimed that the harm they had suffered could not be captured by suing as women only, because GM could point out that it had hired women, white women, prior to 1964, and that it retained them after 1970. So women didn't cover it. They were also unwilling to sue on the basis of race alone, because the discrimination they suffered was not merely racial. It was as a combination of race and sex. They did not prevail in this case, and the district court rejected the claim. It said this: the prospect of the creation of new classes of protected minorities governed only by the mathematical principles of permutation and combination clearly raises the prospect of opening the hackneyed Pandora's box. Yet, as Crenshaw points out, and she's right to do so, these women were clearly suffering from the combined possession of 2 disadvantageous traits, and neither Black men nor white women found themselves in quite the same situation. This is the birth of the metaphor of intersectionality. Black women are finding themselves at the intersection of two different kinds of prejudice, race and sex. In fact, Crenshaw goes further to say that these two aspects of identity intersect to form a new category altogether, Black women. And writers since Crenshaw have put it even more radically than this, and somewhat rightly so. It is not just that a person may be a combination of two traits, race and gender, race and sex, but that every person is a combination of an infinite number of traits. Nor is such a person merely the sum of these traits. The actuality, as one scholar put it, of our layered experience is multiplicative. So in other words, you could be a Black woman or you could be a Black disabled woman. All of those things combine together to furnish you with an identity that is different from those who are only oppressed by one category or two categories. And then of course you can have many more categories than one or two. Now, what I've hopefully got on the screen for you here is the image of the intersection. Well, it's very straightforwardly an image of a traffic intersection, and you can see quite clearly that there's a person put in the middle with a big question mark sign. And that person is at the intersection of a number of vectors of BLM, Black Lives Matter. So the person might be Black, the person might be lesbian, gay, bisexual, the flag up there, and then could be transgender. It's possible that that person standing with the question mark in the middle could be multiply oppressed. So here's how Crenshaw describes this image of the intersection. She says this: consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a Black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination. Now, the point is that unlike traditional notions of discrimination, which employ something like a but-for analysis, that is, a white woman would be treated just like a Black man, but for the fact that she is a different sex, the Black woman is subject to discrimination from at least two distinct directions. Furthermore, it's not just that she's discriminated against in these two ways, but that the combination of the two traits produces a categorically different identity still, worthy of protection in its own right. Let me show you a few more images. This will help to give a sense of what exactly is being conveyed here. And here is one. This is, of course, you know, the bubbles each has a particular characteristic: disability, race, sexual orientation, nationality, and gender identity. And the point here is obviously you could have only one of those things, but it's very possible you could have two, you could have three, you could have four or five. Certainly you could have more than that, but these are overlapping. And so if the groups they overlap into are ever smaller, they're still a distinct group. And it's very possible to partake of one or more or all of these identities. Finally, here's one more image to think through these issues. This is a sort of a wheel of domination. It's titled Intersecting Axes of Privilege, Domination, and Oppression. And hopefully you can see it, but the point is that there's an above domination and a below domination. That central line goes right through the middle. And those identities who are found above the line are the dominators. Those who are beneath the line are oppressed. And each of these lines represents a particular trait. So if you look at any one of them in particular, I'll just take white. It's over there on the left, in the top left quadrant. White is the top of the privilege spectrum. And if you follow that line down further and you go to the middle and all the way then down to the bottom, you'll see people of color. So each of these vectors or each of these lines has an opposite, and you can see how each of these things is thought to contribute to either privilege that someone has or oppression. It's worth maybe stopping to study this a bit when you have the chance. finally, here's one last image. It is actually a quiz you can take online. Now, in a way, it's not a serious descriptive understand. It does not give you a descriptive understanding of intersectionality. It almost makes fun of the concept, but what it does is allow you to get a score in terms of your intersectional privilege or oppression. And you can see you've got little sliders. You can go from white to person of color, straight to gay, male to female, and you'll come out with some number on, I think it's a 100-point scale. It's an interesting thing to do to see where your identity ranks in the terms of intersectionality. Don't take it too seriously, but it is, I just wanted you to know it's out there. All right, so to summarize, intersectionality was a revolutionary idea in 1989 when Crenshaw created the term. And in the 30 years since then, it has become a major subject of study in a variety of fields. So it's not just women's and gender studies departments. I would venture to say that almost every part of the university has been impacted by intersectionality. There are ways of looking at every subject that can be seen through an intersectional lens. Again, the intersectionality postulates that single factors, race, gender, sexuality, cannot adequately account for the diverse identities possessed by any person or group of people. Instead, identity is composed of all sorts of sub-identities: handicap, race, sex, sexual orientation, and so on. What's not put into this list is things like intellectual perspective, political leaning, and religious identification. Also, important to note, fundamental to the intersectionality project is the assumption that racism, classism, and heterosexism are structural problems, not individual problems. We've heard much more about this in recent months. There's structural racism in the United States. But this is a standard distinction in sociology between structure and agency, and a key move that you'll see throughout the literature of intersectionality. According to the structural account, individuals don't necessarily need to be racist or sexist themselves, but they are part of larger institutions that embody racism, sexism, patriarchy, and other such things. To use a contemporary turn of phrase, these evils are baked into institutions, universities, government agencies, even families, churches. A crucial argument of intersectionality is that institutional power arrangements are rooted in domination and subordination, and they confound and constrict the life possibilities of those who already live at the intersection of certain identity categories. And then they privilege others who are highly privileged. One of the benefits of intersectional analysis is said to be that it avoids reducing oppression to a single factor. So what this does and what this means in terms of institutions is that they must be reconstituted from the bottom up, so that the least advantaged are put first, or at least made equal with all others. As one scholar has put it, rather than importing models from the regimes they want to disrupt, intersectional theorists must begin their analytical endeavors by attending to the most disadvantaged. Here is a popular image that is used to talk about the supposed benefits of intersectionality. They've got on the one side, the equality, the people are watching the sports game behind a fence. The equal podiums make them equal not podiums, platforms. Equal platforms make them equal. Well, but what's necessary is an equalization of their ability. So instead of just giving them an equal platform, they are given the platform that accounts for the disadvantage. So of course, the shortest person under the equity model is at the top level with everybody else. And there's an equality of outcome in this understanding. Okay, so those are some images that help us think through intersectionality as it's usually seen, and frankly, those are usually images that are used in training programs to get people to be sensitive to intersectionality. There are four there are probably many more than this, but 4 primary assumptions that I want to highlight for you here that underlie the intersectional project. The first up here, as you can see, if you're seeing my shared screen, human identity is primarily composed of ascriptive characteristics: race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, and ableism, handicap status, so on, things like that. Things like ideas, thoughts, religious belief are secondary. So it's these kind of demographic characteristics, or as some people would say, accidental characteristics that compose your intersectional identity. The second assumption is this, that social and political life is primarily a matter of oppression and privilege. So there's a way of looking at all of social life as a matter of oppression and privilege. Who has more privilege, who has less privilege, who is more oppressed, who is not oppressed at all. There's a way of looking at the whole of society through this lens. The third point is that the primary goal of wide swaths of the academy is to study oneself and one's privilege or lack of it, with the aim of reforming society to more fairly treat those who have less privilege. So you will see this in universities all across the board, but especially in what are so-called grievance studies, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual studies, women's and gender studies, and so on. Part of what you do in those classes is to learn where do you stand on the privilege oppression scale, and how might you come up from oppression or reduce your privilege to make people more equal. And then finally, the fourth assumption is follows from the third. It's the idea that a university, or universities as a group, are not retreats from the world. They are centers of political activism. That, in other words, you don't take your time at a university to step back, contemplate, but you are actually engaged in learning how to be an activist and learning how to be a successful one. And they're also primarily places where you learn about yourself. Let me just say a few short words about each of these points. With regard to number 1, human identity is composed of ascriptive characteristics. Each of the characteristics we have has a positive or a negative value. And is designated by convention in ways that we could all understand. A woman is more negative, a man is more positive. Black or Hispanic is negative, white is positive. So it's almost as if you could put numbers to these traits in the way that Intersectionality Quiz does. Now, of course, intersectionality doesn't really like putting numbers to things, but it is true that privilege can accumulate, and oppression can also accumulate. And you do find yourself in what is termed sometimes the matrix of oppression, in a different place based on the demographic characteristics that make up you. In general, people exist on a continuum, with straight, white, able-bodied men at the height of privilege, and somebody like a Black, disabled, bisexual who would stand at the low point of oppression. Here's how one scholar puts it. The overarching matrix of domination houses multiple groups, each with varying experiences with penalty and privilege, that produce corresponding partial perspectives and situated knowledges. The problem with this framework is that it does ascribe fixed positive and negative values to each characteristic. At the same time, the greater the level of oppression, the more seriously a person's views are taken. So this is what we see now so often in public life. It's an inverse relationship. The more privilege one has, the less that person needs to be heard. The assumption, of course, is that that person's privilege has already had its positive effect. The person has aimed not only at advancing himself or herself, but is also aimed at oppressing other people. So this is why you will often hear that the white men have already had their say. They don't need to speak anymore. We need to hear from people who've been disenfranchised in the past. There's also an assumption that those with privilege are always actively resisting the people who are trying to gain more power or more privilege. But the oppressed are incapable of harming those who are above them. Those are also assumptions that go with this. The second point, I really don't have much to say here except to point out that social and political life is a matter primarily of oppression and privilege. So there are many other ways of looking at social life. We could operate on a notion that we are all formal equals, that work will hopefully yield good outcomes. But for the intersectionality, for the world of intersectionality, all that stuff is secondary to the notion that oppression and privilege structure the basic social relations. The third part, the primary goal of the academy, is to study oneself and one's privilege. That does seem to be more and more true in contemporary universities. Mark Lilla, who you may know, a social commentator and not a conservative, has written this. At a very young age, our children are being encouraged to talk about their individual identities, even before they have them. By the time they reach college, many assume that diversity discourse exhausts political discourse and have shockingly little to say about such perennial questions as class, war, the economy, and the common good. When young people arrive at college, they are encouraged to keep this focus on themselves by student groups, faculty members, and administrators whose full-time job is to deal with and heighten the significance of diversity issues. This is especially pronounced in fields that emphasize intersectionality, but the assumption is also that self-identity structures all subsequent academic inquiry and can be translated into numerous areas where identity studies might not seem natural. For example, art history, philosophy. There are many, many books in art history and in philosophy in the present day that are structured by an intersectional analysis. Finally, universities are, this follows directly from what I've just been saying, meant to foster political activism. Here's one prominent professor of women's and gender studies who writes this. The binary distinctions between academic work and activist analysis is impossible for me to inhabit. Like many in my position, I could not tell you where my activist analysis ends and my academic work begins, or vice versa. So in other words, the two lives are intricately linked. The idea that there would be a disinterested love of learning, learning for its own sake, all these old-fashioned notions of what a university is for, that's not even on the radar for most of this world. They define themselves as intellectual activists. So now I'm going to make a few criticisms of intersectionality because I do think it's worthy of criticizing. I think originally, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer period, the original insight that Crenshaw makes is a good one. It's true. It was obviously true in the situation that a group of Black women were being disparately treated and needed to be recognized as a different group from white women or Black men. But what has happened in practice is, though those women didn't get relief in their case, the court was right about its Pandora's box problem. Remember, the court said the creation of new classes of protected minorities would open a new Pandora's box. And this has turned out to be the case in the social and political theory that intersectionality has produced. So here's a question. What parts of identity do we include when we're assembling personal identity? Do we include religious affiliation? Do we include birth order? Do we include family of origin structure? No, we include the standard identity politics categories: race, gender, and sexuality. So here's an obvious fact about intersectionality. While it is potentially helpful and even necessary in certain situations, like the legal one I mentioned, the truth is, as we all know, and as intersectionality knows too, human identity is multi-layered and very complex. And it isn't clear that intersectionality says much new on this score, except to organize people into politically activist groups. Intersectionality does assign values of oppression and privilege to each identity characteristic. But does this yield a better hope of revolutionary change for those who promote the theory? It might. But in practice, intersectionality has often tended to divide people with various intersectional identities. It's not a given that everybody who falls on the matrix of oppression is going to band together to work together in terms of social and political change. So who should have the greater say? the Black lesbian or the Hispanic transgender person? Can white women ever speak for all women? Or are they only one step removed from the primary oppressors, who are white men? There's a British journalist by the name of Helen Lewis who has written an amusing account of the problem here. It seems like there can really be no winners in intersectionality. Let me read you her account. Are you holding your meeting in a room which isn't accessible to wheelchairs? Congratulations, you just founded an all able-bodied feminist campaign group by default. And she continues, but what about the deaf, the blind? Should a group of feminists starting their own meetup in a university hall enlist someone proficient in sign language in case that's needed? Should they print their leaflets in Braille? Her comments highlight the divisions that may arise in the world of intersectionality. What categories should be included, what excluded, and what constitutes a good faith effort at inclusion. Second problem, intersectionality tends toward division. Because in exponentially problematizing the notion of identity, one finds that former coalitions can no longer exist. This would seem to make political organizing more difficult, not less. Despite Crenshaw's hope in 1991, writing more about intersectionality, that an awareness of intersectionality would allow us to acknowledge and ground the differences among us and negotiate the means by which these differences will find expression in group preferences, it seems that differences have not unified, but tended to divide. As someone else wrote, the endlessness of differences seems to be a weak point in intersectional theory. And another intersectional theorist, I mean, these are intersectional theorists writing criticisms of their own method. A woman, Catherine Russell, argues that we lack arguments about when and where we can emphasize one factor over another. And some intersectional theorists realize that even the more fine-grained distinctions still fail to capture the essential differences in identity between individuals. In describing Black women as wholly oppressed and marginalized, intersectional theory cannot attend to variations within Black women's experiences that afford some Black women greater privilege, autonomy, and freedom. So to put this point very bluntly, both the single mother living in a housing project in New Orleans and Michelle Obama are Black women, yet their lived experiences will have very little in common. Finally, it isn't clear that this theory of intersectionality is adequately preparing the ground for the praxis of political change. The question is really, has intersectionality yielded the kinds of social and political changes and reforms that it was promising back in 1989? In large part, the answer is no. We talk about intersectionality, but it really remains the province of academics, left-leaning academics who write a ton about it and don't try to include people who are not already on board with them. Universities are, of course, great places of indoctrination into this theory, but in the broader world, it tends to just be something that you hear about in conservative news outlets, which dismiss it altogether, which I frankly don't think is fair either. Let me say one last thing by way of a kind of criticism or a way of defending a critique of intersectionality, which is really this. The most serious problem in intersectionality is, frankly, a denial of human freedom that's inherent in the project. You know, on the one hand, intersectional theorists purport to be all about releasing people from the chains of their oppression so that they might live more free and fulfilling lives. But in a certain sense, intersectionality is a kind of determinism, perhaps even a racism and sexism of its own, insofar as it places people in categories and asserts that their identities are based on traits over which they have absolutely no control. I'm not arguing here that intersectionality is reverse racism or that white men should embrace identity politics like the version promoted by the alt-right provocateur Richard Spencer. Some of you may know him. Spencer claims, by the way, that Donald Trump is the first step toward identity politics for European Americans in the United States, and unabashedly says he is doing no more than what other oppressed groups have long done. I think this is obviously the wrong approach. But I would I think a serious response to this is to suggest that we revisit this entire notion of identity, not beginning with the assumption that structural causes always dominate social relationships, but that individual agency is vitally important for a flourishing human life. As I've already observed above, the debate stands at the center of modern sociology, and now it seems to be taken for granted that the structural explanation always wins. But since intersectionality goes so far with this structural explanation, I think we need to temper it a bit, and to remind people that human self-understanding is a vital part of identity, and it's not accounted for very well in the intersectional project. One short comment on socialism. Socialism and intersectionality, how do these overlap? Well, every aspect of identity yields some privilege or disadvantage in intersectionality. Whiteness, as we know, is an advantage. Female is a disadvantage. Straight is an advantage, and so on. You know this already by now. But imagine that let's imagine what's being left out of the analysis. Well, one major thing, which is wealth. If intersectionality is about power, social and political power, what characteristic or privilege confers perhaps the most power of all? And it's money. And so I think until we include money in our analysis of privilege and disadvantage, we're failing to account for perhaps the greatest source of inequality of all. To the extent that intersectionality aims at equality, or as the picture tells you, equity, we must also equalize wealth and resources. It's not just oppression and privilege, it's also wealth and resources. So the socialist impulse, or this idea that we must be equal in all ways, and that includes financially, is deeply resonant with the intersectional project. This is not a new idea, though I believe it has been mostly soft-pedaled over the past few decades. There were movements in the 1970s called socialist feminists, and they argued that liberation could only be achieved by working to end the economic and cultural sources of oppression. But they made an intersectional argument. Women's class status is generally derivative of her husband's class or occupational status. Behind all of this was the passion for equality of condition and dismantling traditional structures of hierarchy. So socialism is yet another vector, or socialism versus capitalism is probably another vector on the intersectional analysis. I've said enough, so let me pause here and maybe we'll have time to take some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Corey. I think we had some problems with the sound when we first started, so let me start the introduction again. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute. Thank you to all of you who've joined. We're delighted that even during this time of COVID, we can do the Acton Lecture Series. And we're delighted to have as our presenter, who you just heard, Dr. Elizabeth Corey. In case you didn't see her biography, she is a professor of political science at Baylor and the director of the honors program. And she has her PhD from LSU. So she's written on a number of things. We're delighted to have Professor Corey here. So we're going to take questions. So please send your questions in. You saw on the live stream how to do it in through Facebook or for the digital. So please send that in. And our communications director is going to forward those to me. So if you don't get your question answered, we're trying our best, but he's going to try to group them. So Dr. Corey, you've given this talk on intersectionality. It's a very complex topic, and I liked how you started with the origins of it in the automotive case with the discrimination. And I watched Dr. Crenshaw's lecture on this, and I think it's an interesting. She sets out this problem, which is a real problem, that you could be discriminated against, not simply because you're black or a woman, because you are a black woman. And you've talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could try to summarize what takes that idea, which I think is pretty much, I think most people would say that's totally reasonable. How does that become what it is today, and the kind of activism around it that you discussed in your lecture?
Yeah, that's a really good and a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can give you the full answer, but I'll try. I mean, insofar as the logic of that goes, as I mentioned, the court did not rule in favor of the black women who were suing GM. It actually denied their claims. because it said this quote about the Pandora's box, that once we open up identity to not just Black women, but to Black women who are disabled, Black women who are disabled and lesbian, you're bringing into the law groups that cannot be controlled. And the court did not want to go there. Now, that's a kind of different thing from what an academic, an academic theorist can do, because actually you can say, well, insofar as a group of Black women is different from all women, then lesbian Black women are different more still. And so there are frankly infinite characteristics that you could assemble into these different groups. And that is precisely what intersectionality in the academy has done, so that you now have all sorts of intersectional groups. And as some people are arguing, it's not just these sort of discrete groupings, Black, lesbian, women, but it's somehow the identities are multiplied and felt at some times, but not at others. And the groups are constantly changing. I mean, once you get into this literature, it's almost impossible to keep up with it. But they didn't have to face some of the practical questions that the court is dealing with. They are not setting up new protected classes. So I think, as in many cases, you can do things in the academy that are, not necessarily related to actual practice in the world. And that's both a benefit sometimes and also a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, like a philosophical question that I think you discussed, but you could maybe help explain a little bit. What's the difference, say, between, I mean, you did this a bit, but looking seriously at the different lived experiences of people who have these different subjective lived experiences. And so in philosophy, we talk about intersubjectivity, right? That I try to understand you as a subject. So like Martin Buber, right, the very famous book, I and Thou, or people like Max Shaler, I, so that you and I are different, but we try to have an intersubjective understanding of one another. How does that relate to intersectionality, which seems to, at least in certain cases, deny the possibility of intersubjectivity?
That's a super hard question to answer. I can answer it in a kind of simple way, or start out by saying, in one sense, intersubjectivity, as you're describing it, which is the sympathetic understanding of other people's experiences, and intersectionality are directly opposed. In the sense that it is assumed that anybody who hasn't had the lived experiences that you have had cannot understand your experiences as you narrate them. So that a Black woman can't understand a gay white man. But the weird thing about intersectionality is that actually what is also assumed, sort of implicitly, is that everybody on the bottom levels of oppression actually does understand the people who are ahead of them, or who are, more privileged than they are. So the Black woman has a particular insight into white women and white men because she has been the subject of discrimination by them for so many years. This is, I have talked about it elsewhere. This is the premise of standpoint theory, which is a popular feminist method of analysis, where people are telling their stories from particular standpoints, and they understand things that people in more privileged standpoints don't understand and can't understand because they haven't been there. So you can imagine, a Hispanic maid would say, I get white culture in a way that the white people themselves do not get, because I have been subject to injustices and oppression. So in a way, it actually, all of this speaks against the kind of intersubjectivity you're asking for, because you're not being invited into other people's experiences. You're being told, if you have privilege, you're being told you can't understand what it's like to be me. And I think that's a very serious problem for the common good, democracy, because if it is true that I cannot understand people who are radically unlike myself, then what do we do about that?
Okay, so I have a couple questions that have come in from from viewers. So here's one of them. Do you think the intersectional theory movement will ever be able to unite as a cohesive movement? The questioner asks. He or she writes, they seem to agree on an enemy, quotes, but they historically struggled to get everyone under one banner, resulting in pretty fierce fighting. For example, the example is the San Francisco parade being shut down multiple times because of different groups were protesting different aspects of the parade as a whole. So that's the question. Do you think the intersectional theory movement will ever be able to be united as a cohesive movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my sense is no, simply because there are so many people who frankly don't buy other parts of other intersectional groups' agenda. So for example, you could certainly imagine, and actually I've read about this happening, in the past, say Black women and Black men have been much more conservative on marriage issues. So the idea that they would ally with the LGBTQ groups on matters having to do with marriage is not going to happen. So we kind of have to come to terms with the fact that actually these groups are not necessarily united on the things that oppress them, and it is possible that they could not only not unite but even fragment into kind of competing interests. And I think we have seen that happen. Does it matter? Well, I suppose you could say the whole world of intersectionality is anti-oppression, but then you have to start to say, well, what kinds of oppression are we talking about? And can we agree on a definition of oppression, and whose oppression is more and worse? And that is what the literature talks about ad nauseum. I mean, it is just, well, you've not got the intersectionality framework right. Let me show you how it is. So do I think it's practically possible? Probably not, simply because people, despite the fact that they're supposedly determined by their demographics, actually do think for themselves very often and don't end up in agreement with all the other oppressed groups.
Okay, so that in a sense, that there's almost this is a question to follow up, but there's almost like there's a certain, I'll say, ideological preconceived view of what certain people should think. And if a certain person who should have that, like, intersection ABC should think this, and if they don't think that, I mean, I think this is, you mentioned more problems than that, but if person ABC, intersection ABC, doesn't hold what the ideology says ABC is supposed to hold, they're kind of pushed out to the side. Plus, you're going to have, a lot of it's like a preconceived or pre-decided view. Is that what you're saying? So that the ultimately unity is too complex just because of the multiplicity of viewpoints?
Yes. Well, I mean, think in practice about people kind of public intellectuals who take positions that are contrary to what mainstream social justice thinks ought to be their position. So, for example, Glenn Loury from Brown University was very public in a letter he wrote to Brown, and he was making an argument that would not fit the experience of progressive Black activists, and he got in a lot of trouble for that. People were very angry at him for doing that. So yes, to a certain extent, you're expected to follow a kind of script. Now the scripts change. A white woman and a Black woman are very different, and that's actually been one of the things. Black feminists have said, well, white women are always speaking for us. They don't have our interests in mind. So even the idea that women is a big group that encompasses everybody. Well, that it's very hard even to organize on one of the larger groups when we're always in danger of fracturing out. And so, yes, I think that's part of the problem. Women too, Heather McDonald's a great example, who don't follow the script on what she ought to be saying are also said to be heterodox.
Right. So here's another question from a viewer. How can any white man or woman be absolved of their privilege and prove it? That's the question. So I guess that's the question. Is it possible? Sure. Let me restate. Is it possible for a white man or a woman to be absolved of their privilege and prove it so that they become because I think they even use the term sin, so they become absolved of that status?
I wish I could say yes. I mean, I think a lot of people tried to do this. At my own university, I can think of a number of people who are white and men and are very public about their progressive stance on many, many things. And they've actually staked their scholarly careers on these things so that, they're not doing, disinterested study in Chaucer, but they're actually doing, racial politics in the 20th century right now. So I think people like that are really making an effort to say, I'm an ally, but not only am I an ally, I'm a super ally. So that if I can't be a part of an oppressed group, I want to be the best ally that I can. And I think people earnestly mean it when they say they're trying to do this. I don't think they're doing it just for credibility. But can they be totally absolved? I don't think so ever. Because and Josh Mitchell is at Georgetown is really good on this. There's the notion of guilt sort of taken from Christianity, but there's no real possibility of forgiveness here. So that the oppression that you have been part of by virtue of your class or your sex is baked in, again, to use that expression. Yeah. It's never going away. So that you can try very hard and you can be a better or a worse white man from the point of view of progressive politics, but you're never completely absolved of it. So no, I don't think it's possible.
Okay, as you were talking, I have a note where you said baked in your lecture, and I thought, okay, it seems like like to use this theological term, that redemption isn't possible because let's say the sin is baked into you in such a way that it's non-redeemable. Would that be a correct articulation of what you said?
It is. Now, I'm not sure. Well, I think I do believe that. Josh Mitchell's theory is very strong. He says, this is actually something like a Christian heresy. It's taking the categories of Christianity, but putting them into secular terms. So the guilt is racism and sexism, and the hope is that we can sort of be delivered from that. But then again, as he points out, there's no forgiveness. Other people have written about this. I would recommend Molly. I can't think of her last name. She writes for Law and Liberty. Also, Andrew Sullivan has done some work on this, David French. I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying identity politics is a kind of religion, and the intersectional project is a kind of, and it's pursued with a kind of religious fervor. I believe that to be true. It definitely is. I wrote a piece in First Things called First Church of Intersectionality, which was my experience at a conference on intersectionality at Notre Dame. And the queen of intersectionality studies is Patricia Hill Collins, a very smart woman, Black woman in her 60s or 70s. And she got up and she gave a sermon about the importance of intersectionality. And the whole audience was just, saying, yeah, this is right. And people were standing up and, saying amen. I mean, they didn't say amen, but it was clear that she was preaching and not giving an academic lecture. So is there a religious element to this? Absolutely, there is. But again, how do we ever get out of it? I don't think we do. It's permanent. And let me say one last thing. I think part of the reason for that is what intersectionality wants is not to be assimilated. Like Black women don't want to just be assimilated and be just like white men. They actually want, and this is called the politics of recognition, and there's a whole literature around this. They want to be recognized as Black women who are distinctly different. White women want to be recognized as women who are distinctly different. So what they're after is not a kind of assimilation into the broader political world, but it is, I want you to see me as me with all my difference, and to mark even the things that give me my identity that originally came out of oppression.
Okay, yeah, I think it's an interesting phenomena across the board, not just with identity politics, but I think a lot of, modern, meaning the last 200 years of Western political thought, are often inspired by Christianity. So they are Christian heresies. I mean, Marxism, of course, is a perfect example of this. And so I think it's interesting to see. I wrote a piece recently at Acton talking about how in late secularism, with empiricist rationality becoming dominant, where the only thing that is reasonable is that which is empirical. What happens is it doesn't actually make us more reasonable. We see the reemergence of myth and the reemergence of religious impulses. So I think it's interesting that this section too, there are many things going on in modern politics, but I think the example that you gave of identity politics and the religious fervor, I tend to think that it's most of the dominant political movements today, from contemporary kind of globalism type to identity politics and beyond, have a religious element to them. So I think it's interesting that you brought that up. And I think this is another reason why it's important that we analyze these things from a multidisciplinary way, that we think about it philosophically, economically, theologically, and so on. So go ahead, please.
Let me just jump in here and say the person whose name I couldn't remember is Molly McGrath, and she's written a very influential piece on identity politics as religion in its religious character, and it's at the Law and Liberty website. Please go check it out. It's super.
Oh, good. I haven't read that, so I'll look at that too. So another question from a viewer. Why wouldn't equality of opportunity be a sufficient answer to the inequities of privilege? Wouldn't going further than that increase conflict without doing anything to bring greater equity? I think this probably goes to your diagram of watching the sports game. So one more time, why wouldn't equality of opportunity be sufficient? Why would going further just increase conflict?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it does make me think immediately of the graphic I showed you, where the equality was the three people on the platforms, but they ended up in different places, and equity was the three people on the differing platforms, so that their chances and opportunities were equalized. The best way I can think of to illustrate this is to remember a piece by Stanley Fish that was written probably 20-something years ago. And he begins, and I can't remember the name of it, but it had to do with affirmative action. And he says, is it fair to have a race where the two runners are at the starting line, and one of them has been training for years and is in fabulous shape, and the other has been chained up for years and has just been released from his chains and comes up to the starting line. Now, are these two people really equal? So we're, of course, meant to say, okay, well, the starting line for whites and blacks in the United States are not the same, because blacks have been chained up for all these years, metaphorically, and whites have been training. I think that is really the standard answer to why you can't just say equality of opportunity, because people will say, and I think there is a lot to this, that the structural things, impediments that have held people back are real. And I think that has to be taken into account. I think the problem is that in the present day, that is taken to such a degree that we've got to somehow try to make equal in equity all people, and I think that's impossible. But that's why. I mean, because it's one thing to say, we could just let everybody have the same opportunities, but I think people would say, well, but they already don't. They're already starting from a disadvantage.
Right. I think that's an important point, which is a question I had interested to hear you talk about. So, you talked about Kimberly Crenshaw's piece, and she makes this. From what I've heard of her argument, parts of it I think are right. It's the fact that some people are discriminated against. It's a difficult situation, and while I may have problems with the intersubjectivity versus intersectionality, I actually do think there is possibility, at least for some intersubjectivity, right? You need some of it to be able to understand and say, wait, this is a situation that I myself have never gone through. And part of it is, I think, this raising of awareness to realize, oh, wait a minute, I haven't even thought about that before. I didn't come to that conclusion. So I think raising that, is a very important part of it. I think there can be tell me how you react to this. There can be a reaction, say, among conservatives or people who are skeptical of the theory, to say, well, okay, just the whole thing's crazy. But it's clearly compelling, right, to people. It's completely touching on something. And I think we've already said it's not just compelling. It's grounded in certain true lived experiences of people, and it's also compelling, right? So why why do you think it is so compelling? And what would you say to, say, a conservative who may agree with your critique, but would just almost immediately throw it out? What would you say to a conservative? Say, you need to think about it in this way as opposed to maybe just a reactionary way? Because we live in this, obviously, this time of highly reactionary politics. I sometimes joke, like, the way I'm going to figure out what my position is, I want to know what my opponent thinks, and I'll just take the opposite, right? But so in that kind of culture we live in, it's easy just to reject things. What would you say about why it's compelling, and for someone who doesn't like the idea and has problems with the idea, how would you encourage people to engage it and really wrestle with it?
Oh gosh, that's a fabulous question. It's worthy of a discussion all its own. There are a lot of ways to go at this. I mean, I think your notion of intersubjectivity is probably the right way, because look, what are the intersectional theories asking for? They're asking that the people who have, I don't love to use these terms, but I'll use them for now. The people who have privilege already need to understand that there are a lot of people who don't have that privilege. And it would be very helpful and kind and charitable if you would engage with those who have not had your privileges, and understand who they are and where they come from and why life has maybe been more difficult for them. I mean, that is a basic Christian insight. I think what conservatives tend to react against is the kind of weaponization of that insight in intersectionality, so that yes, of course, you ought to try to understand the experiences of other people, but intersectionality sometimes says you can't understand the experiences of me unless you've been me, which is very off-putting. And then the whole thing is weaponized in the sense that it is actually meant to take people who have formerly held power and put them out of power. So that, the kinds of things we see now, we don't need any more white men in power. We don't need any more white men in the academy. We don't need any more white women. We need to get people of color and this sort of thing. So I think conservatives are rejecting that, but the insight that, look, we all come into the world with various degrees of privilege and oppression, if we want to think in terms of that. I don't think that's the only way to think about social life. But it is true that we all come in a particular situation with a particular family. And it's a basic principle of charity, civility, to be able to engage and understand other people who are different from us. I mean, that's a kind of almost a platitude, but it's again coming back to John Stuart Mill, liberty of thought and discussion. You've got to understand your opponent's view from the strongest possible perspective. And that is actually what got me started in intersectionality. I thought, this is really important. I ought to know what it's about, and I ought to hear it from the people who believe it and not from the conservatives who want to tear it down, even though I too have objections and criticisms to it.
And then maybe just the final question, which is following on that. I think maybe I'm creating an intersectional error because I'm trying to think, what would somebody who has this theory, who agrees with this theory, say? I mean, would an answer be like, okay, that's great, but don't we have to weaponize this because talk of charity hasn't gotten us where we need to get? What would you say? Because I'm assuming that would be the first reaction, that's why it's weaponized, and that it's, in a sense, aren't we just dealing with the question of power versus power, and that's the only way to change things? How do you respond to that? I know that's now you're a political philosopher, so I just opened up 4 Pandora's boxes on the question of power, but
Pandora's boxes, right? No, of course you did. That is a very interesting question to me, and it's actually one I was able to pose at this conference I went to Patricia Hill Collins herself. I stood up. I'm sure that I was the only conservative in the audience, and I said, "Well, here's my question: how do you and other theorists of intersectionality," I said it more nicely than this, but I said something like, "How do you engage with, those terrible people, those conservatives?" I didn't say terrible, but I said something like, "How do you engage with conservatives who are skeptical of your project?" And she said, "You can't. It's a line in the sand. This is a power contest." And that was what she said. So it made it very clear to me that they are not very interested, if at all interested, in trying to understand the other points of view, because it is an ideology in the sense that once you kind of enter into this world, then everything makes sense, in the same way Marxism is, and so many other modern 21st century ideologies. It's all explained, and that's very comforting. And that's again, I suppose, a kind of Gnostic religion. But the truth is, I mean, and I hate to end on a depressing note, but I do think a lot of this has has moved from an insight into something that's really true, which I think the insight of originally of intersectionality is, into a political weapon. And it's being used pretty well, because as you'll notice, intersectionality is now, whether it's called this or not, everywhere in culture.
Yeah, I think, this is closing off with a philosophical insight that you make this point. I think it's important that, one, we live in an ideological age. So the nature of every theory is to become ideological, to be a theory of everything, right? Where we're, everybody has to compete with their theory of everything, which I think is a real problem. And I think the other thing that that strikes me is that you talked about this kind of Gnostic element. Joseph Ratzinger, before he became Benedict XVI, wrote a lot about the problem of reason, and that we've reduced reason to the empirical. And so the problem is, if justice and beauty and goodness and truth are non-empirical, then what happens in politics? Well, politics becomes only about power. And so it's just power versus power. And so I would say one of the challenges is, I think you said, that there are good insights into the intersectionality movement, but they, like everything else, get embedded in this culture of empiricist rationality, where all we have is power versus power. And so the dialogical nature of what politics should be is fallen apart. And so I think it's an interesting, in some ways complex, it's an open to a lot of things, but in many ways a wrap to this discussion, in that it's a challenge in our age that's ideological. How do we think about intersectionality and everything else? And how do we pull back, in a sense, from ideology? So I'll give you the last word after that.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And in an ideal world, you would imagine that colleges would be teaching this kind of moving away from power to philosophy. So that you could examine intersectionality from all sides and say, well, here's the kernel of insight. Here's what I love about it. But here's where it starts to become an ideology. Here's where it's being used as a club against your opponents. The problem is, it's very rare that you'll find a class like that in college, because people come at it either as critics or as supporters, and not much in between. And that's a shame, because the university was not meant to be a place of ideology, but it has mostly turned into it, with some exceptions. I think we still have hope in the United States, but those places are few and far between.
Good. Well, thank you, Dr. Corey. I hope we had at least a beginning of that discussion here. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us at the Acton Institute. Thanks to all of you who took time out of your day to watch. We appreciate it. Please follow up, give us any suggestions, and thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.